So welcome to Cross and Creation number 3. And so far, the story is that we're looking at penal substitution and looking for a better way to look at it.
We are.
So we began by taking the gospel story back to Genesis 1 rather than Genesis 3, and ask ourselves, if we began the gospel in Genesis 1 with creation ex nihilo, what would be the problem for which the cross is the solution? Rather a different question than beginning in Genesis 3 with the fall. What we talked about is that historically there's probably been a diversion between the creationist view of the gospel and a more penal view of the gospel, which we characterised as cross and creation. And efforts to bring them together have not been that successful. And I think last time I talked about the 19th century and in the history of the evangelicalism in England in the 19th century, the first half of the 19th century, the old evangelicals emphasised the cross, but then there was a move away from that towards the incarnation. And that's actually apparently when Christmas became as widely celebrated. Apparently it was not as widely celebrated as Easter. But the ability to bring the two together it was always difficult for people. So that's what we've talked about. In other words, our goal would be to put the cross and creation together. Now, and we've talked about the problems with the traditional penal substitution atonement. You've got a particular angle on that, which is your story, different to my story.
Yeah.
Your background. Do you want to just explain that?
Sure. So I alluded to this in the first talk we did, and people come to atonement theories from different trajectories. I grew up in a church that was very, very reformed. Wasn't Presbyterian, but it was Presbyterian reformed sort of style, which I grew up with something called limited atonement, which was that who did Christ die for?
That's part of the tulip.
It is part of the tulip. Yeah. No, I
hardcore Calvinism.
It was pretty hardcore. Yeah, defensive posture. Yeah, I learned tulip jokes as a teenager. So yeah, that was the background. And limited atonement means Christ only died for the elect. So in Sunday school, as children, you'd be asked, who did Christ die for? And you'd say everybody, and you'd know, but he just died for the elect. So not many people come from that sort of background. And it's problematic because as soon as you go down that path, you're sort of saying God predestined some for eternity and some were predestined for hell,
which is called double.
And when you read your Bible, that doesn't pop out. Like it's difficult. And one of the reasons I liked Anglicans more than Presbyterians and evangelicals more than Reformed was there was more of an epistemic humility, where evangelicals wouldn't go that far. Anglicans wouldn't go that far. They'd say, yeah, we'll leave that unknown. We can see how the logic drives you there. And the nasty question you would ask somebody who is evangelical or Anglican is, are there people in hell for whom Christ died? And so the problem, when you want to soften, move away from that limited atonement, the problem for you is, how do you keep the death of Christ elevated? Because all of a sudden you're saying Christ's death was not sufficient to do what we thought it was supposed to. There's Christ's death and something else, and so that becomes a bit of an anathema. So when I went to college, that was probably the big issue I wanted to try to resolve. Everybody else, you assume that somebody's thought that through and realised there were lots of atonement theories. Lots of people were trying to grapple with those ideas of how do you keep the death of Christ high and still not have a limited atonement. So that's the background that I came from, and that it does become important. Like, I think I went in thinking this is just an idea and you can't do any damage thinking about this idea, nothing can go wrong. except when you've got now I must say, all the people in Tamworth from a reform background were the most lovely people you'd ever meet. But there's a logic that says we should be able to imitate God. And when you've got a God who has retributive justice rather than restorative justice, then that's the God you're supposed to imitate. It does send you on a different direction when you've got a different doctrine of God.
Well, I think that's a really critical issue behind this, which is the picture. Your doctrine will imply a picture of
Absolutely.
God, and that picture of God will become very influential in your life, probably even at a subconscious level.
Yeah.
The tulip, the 5 points of tulip were, of course, created out of the Synod of Dort in 1618 and 1619, and the less you know about that, the better. Because they essentially killed their opponents or sent them to life imprisonment. The sponsor of there was the Reformed group who developed tulip at the Synod of Dort, the 5 points. That's where they came out. Their opponents were called remonstrants, who were actually just like modern evangelicals. Yeah. They were just anyone in Sydney Anglicanism or Baptist would be a remonstrant. They were a minority.
They were.
So they were defeated.
And they lost badly.
And of course, this was the Dutch, there's no kind of grey, just black and white. And it was a European-wide conference. They had people there from every country, but behind both camps, there was a political sponsor. And there were two guys who were running Holland. The prince who was the son of William of Orange.
Oh, really?
And his mentor, whose name I can't pronounce, a long one starting with O, and he was like the prime minister or whatever, and he had a philosophical tutor called Grotius.
Oh yeah,
both of those guys, it's very interesting. They were politicians who believed they were Christians, but they believed in tolerance. They believed in the separation of church and state. And so they were part of the liberal thinking side. It's just very interesting how whatever your picture of God is will lead into actions. So
and vice versa. I think Pascal said God created man in his image, and man's been returning the favour ever since.
Well, I think that's true, but I'm actually I'm not entirely. I think it's much stronger that whatever system you believe has a much bigger influence on than you realise. Anyway, the short story is that several weeks after the creation of Tulip, therefore the victory of the reforms, the Prime Minister guy was executed. Ooh. And Grotius was sentenced to life imprisonment.
Yeah.
That's what you get for not being a 5-point Calvinist. Anyway, Calvinists don't talk about that very much, but they should think about it.
And I must say, the people I know,
they weren't that bad.
No, they weren't. They were lovely, and that's why it became difficult, because at a personal level, these lovely people, and you're thinking, no, the logic of your position drives you to this, but they don't go there.
Yeah, but what I embrace would be perhaps not I think the theological problem becomes a pastoral problem.
Absolutely.
And I sat through a Bible study for our church last 3 or 4 nights ago with a group of other Christians, mature people, very well educated, doing Romans, and frankly they were all grappling with inner demons and a sense of guilt. I was the only one who felt free. Mind you, of course I did say something, but whatever your theology is starts to impact your view of who God is, and that starts to work at your subconscious, which is why these things are important. And anyway, last week I thought what we did was we took some of the big words and tried to reframe them, and I think you led us that in a very, very interesting way. I think the main one was around sin, the way that you recharacterize sin, i.e. however you do it in Genesis 3, which I've heard things like it's the sin of pride
Yeah.
or independence, and that's the source of all sin. You said, and I think that for most people, it's transgressing some moral code,
Yeah.
undefined moral code.
That's what your systematic theology. So if you bring down nearly any systematic theology from your bookshelf, that's what it'll say about sin.
Yeah, and that's your paradigm shift, which I then backed up with that Kierkegaard story. But your paradigm shift, I think, was really significant. I mean, Kierkegaard said sin is despair.
Yeah.
And you said something, you didn't use that language, but it's not believing God intends good for me.
Yeah.
Which could be a way of saying, I don't believe God's loving, I don't believe he's a father. I think that's very, very...
Because that's all that really happens in Genesis 3. Like, there's no sin word. Some people say there's a breach of a moral code. But when was he given the moral code? Some people say while they were walking in the garden together, God gave the moral code. But, that's not in the text. So it's a big jump. So
big jump.
If you just want to deal with what's in front of you in the text, the only thing you really got is Adam got to a point where he didn't trust God intended good and he trusted somebody else.
Yeah. So the reading of that story, obviously I don't think many of us would believe it's literal, like serpent speaking, but we think it is a paradigm to explain the human condition. It's enormously powerful. That's pretty important. So I think that was really helpful. Then the other big word we kind of stretched was wrath. Wrath of God, and stretch that into a parent's love versus this.
Could be indignation.
Indignation.
The word's just anger.
Yeah.
So there's a semantic range, but it's a translator's choice to go that far to say it means wrath, and that's what you've got this problem when you're translating. You can't do it without bias. You've got a view. You've got a theology, and it's very hard for you not to impose it on the translation.
And no matter what word you choose, because poetry is my world, that there are some words, it's true of every word, but there are some big words, and they tend to be nouns that are like the tip of a huge iceberg. Yeah. Underneath them, there's just vast layers of inchoate and expressed meaning. And this wrath one is a really big one. So you could move it to indignation, but nonetheless, we all know that there's times in all of our lives when we're angry for good reason, and it's with good outcomes. So I think that was really good. And then you did faith, which again was powerful. You said it's not an entry ticket to a relationship. It characterizes. So relationships are characterized by the mutuality.
Yeah,
which is
you can define relationships in terms of faith or trust. In that, if you're sitting and just going through it, you trust people's character, and you trust their competency, and you trust their commitment to you. And so there's three measures of trust that you can use. So there might be millions of people in the world who can do your accounting for you, but there might only be a few who've got the sort of character that you'd like to work with. There might be even fewer that are competent to the degree you want. But there's probably only one that's committed to doing your accounting. It's actually not a bad measure to talk about.
Well, I think trust is a two-way street, isn't it? I mean, because that's actually probably what forges a relationship. So that's very powerful when you think about us and God. Now, the other big word, which we have talked about, is the word we want to start with, which is dominion.
Yeah.
Because that's the Genesis 1 word, that the situation, when we go back to Genesis 1, the situation we've got is the role of humanity in the cosmos. Now, we coined the phrase mission failure.
Yeah, that's right.
That there'd been a mission failure. So going back to clarify the mission becomes important. And by the way, since the last time I've read a fair bit of Tom Wright's book, The Day the Revolution Began, and in many ways he's saying very similar things to what we'll be talking about tonight. Dominions could be a problematic word because it can connote control, but let's just not worry about that for the moment. And tonight we're going to work with that word, because what we'll be saying is that if we had asked the question, okay, if we began in Genesis 1 with creation, what's the problem? And if the problem is not transgression of a moral code, what is it? And what we'll be exploring is it was lost dominion.
Yeah.
Lost dominion. So that word of dominion and the dominion of human beings in the cosmos is, I think we just need to make a point at the outset that parts of the Bible develop that very aggressively. And it's just good for people to know that. I would say, I don't want to go into them now, but I'd say that the one book that develops it most extensively is the book of Hebrews, and particularly chapter 2 of the book of Hebrews, where in chapter 2, the book of Hebrews, which is interesting because it's written through a Jewish perspective. You'd expect it to go into sin. It doesn't. It goes into Psalm 8 and lost dominion of humanity over the cosmos. That's how he sees the problem. So we're going to look at two lenses, sort of top down and bottom up.
Yeah.
So I'm the top down guy because I don't like details. I get in the way of a good idea.
Absolutely.
So you call that a theological perspective. That's
for want of a better expression.
And then the bottom up is more exegetical, which is what about this verse, and this verse. So we'll have a bit of a go at both of them today.
I just want to circle back to the limited atonement problem, in that often in theology, your position is about what you're not prepared to give up. And this is where dominion has been very much subordinated, because we've had such a view of the sovereignty of God, particularly as Reformed evangelicals, that we don't talk about our dominion. And it's almost, it's an affront, because we've got sort of the Greek mechanistic view that God's in control of everything. And that rolls off the tongue. That's how it is. And that means that we're not. So part of the problem for people when they're talking about atonement theories is we don't want to give up the idea of God's sovereignty. The idea that God might not have absolute control over absolutely everything is sort of anathema. And that's why limited atonement seems more attractive, because the thing that they don't want to trade off is this concept of the sovereignty of God.
I think that is a really good point, a very important point, actually. And it's a point that I think opens the door for us, because we're going to be looking at a view that gives human beings a great deal more sovereignty than most people think. And it seems that's God, in God's sovereignty, that's what he wants. This very diminished view that evangelicalism and probably a lot of Christianity has fostered is, as you said, we're reprobate and sinful and we can't do anything. And I think that's a vast lie. And it seems to be transgressing the purposes of God.
But you can see if you start your message, your Bible, your gospel at Genesis 3, then you throw away all the dominion passages and you start saying, okay, people will say, people in articles will write that we are no longer the image of God, and therefore we no longer have dominion, because whatever the image of God is, we've marred it, we've destroyed it through sin. Which when you think about it, that's a very, we're talking about metaphors, and people have made them very concrete all of a sudden, where the image of God is much more about role than ontology. Anyway, we're digressing, but that's...
Well, I think that's an important point. Role. If I'm given a role by somebody else,
absolutely,
I carry their authority with me into that role. And if I was, for instance, appointed as the ambassador to a country on behalf of Australia, and this is a concept we'll get into, which I think is quite important. And this metaphor that I'm about to develop is a political metaphor, but that's very biblical. A lot of the Bible has political metaphors. If I become the ambassador to the United States, my role to some extent, or if I'm negotiating a deal on behalf of my country, I'm a plenipotentiary, which means my word goes for the entire 20 million people. And I'm given that. It's not that I'm more important than 20 million people. It's just my role has been given to me. So what you're saying is, if Genesis 1 says God has given us a role, then the power of that role and the extent of that role is not something we're not talking about our worthiness. We're talking about
that's right.
the mission we've been given by the Creator.
It's got nothing to do with worthiness.
Yeah, which is that's a relief.
It's got to do with the worthiness of the person who gives you the task.
Yeah,
because it belongs to them.
Yeah, correct. And of course, what we end up with is a much huger view of God. And you know, a verse I've been thinking about a lot over the last little while through these talks, but others as well, is Paul in Ephesians. And one of the points which Tom Wright makes in this book here, which I mean, he says so many things that resonate with me, but I think we've thought of ourselves before, that he was wondering that if the Reformation thought as much about Ephesians as they did about Romans and Galatians, it would have been very different.
Yeah.
But my point is this: Ephesians is, of course, an epic book, which a lot of theologians and people think it's the high point of his thinking. What's the high point? What does he see as and he's talking to a group of Christians. What's his prayer for them? And you only pray for things that you haven't quite got yet. And his prayer is that you would know the amplitude, the height, the depth, the breadth of the love of God, which passes knowledge. I think we haven't taken that seriously enough. It's shocking, as Kierkegaard says, shocking how much God loves us and how important we are in his cosmos.
Well, again, this is where part of my background that I referred to in the first talk is that when we talk about the love of God, we immediately go to Romans and say, you know, we know God, Christ loved us because he died for us. And while that's important, and you could even say central, it's not the only thing, because it seems to me that when you're made in somebody's image, that is love. Like there's, however you want to word it, there's a commitment to us. And I think we've actually narrowed our understanding of what loving things God does. So being made in his image.
Well, I think I agree with you, because in the gospel I grew up with, the love of God is because he died on the cross for our sins.
Yeah.
Well, no, Paul doesn't say that in Ephesians. In Ephesians, he doesn't begin there. He says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus, the Anointed, who has blessed us with all spiritual blessings in the heavenly places in Christ, even as he chose us in him before the foundation of the world." So the love begins before the foundation of the world. It's not a reaction to a problem.
Yeah.
Well, look, so with that opening,
that's at the opening.
Dominion.
Dominion.
And if we take that word and stretch it, I'll begin with about 5 or 6 stretches that once you start with that word, you have to stretch other things. I'll sketch them without going through them in detail. The first stretch of this word, the very word dominion. This is almost like a poetic study of the word. If you put that word and plop it onto a page, what system of connotation does it imply? The first thing is it will move the sphere of attention from the individual to the cosmos. It just does that, because I have to have dominion over something. I mean, it doesn't work unless I'm a subject with dominion. Now there's what's my object? What's my object of dominion? The whole of the penal substitution thing it's a very individualistic thing. You know, did Christ die for you and so on? Whereas dominion will just by definition shift the mental landscape of God's interest and our position to the cosmic order. That's the first thing it does. And what that then would say, immediately, the scope of salvation has to be the entire cosmos, not just individuals. That God's interest is not to save a group of individuals, it's the regeneration of cosmic order that he's vitally interested in. And that is a model, the salvation of the cosmos, that, you know, when I sit and listen to sermons, it's clear that even well-educated in Anglican or evangelical circles have no concept of this whatsoever. It's a political salvation we've got. as much as anything else. So that's point number one. And point number two, immediately you would go to, okay, now we've got individuals in the cosmos. What's the nature of our relationship to the cosmos? And it appears that humanity is given a governing relationship with the cosmos. We were talking about this at dinner. It appears we're to some extent creating the cosmos, to some extent shaping it, and the interactive shaping role of humanity in the cosmos seems to be utterly central, and that's something Ron's helped us with in Gospel Conversations, that we just seem to be creating reality. But it becomes important even at an individual level that I'm shaping my life. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the great books which influenced the Renaissance, and I've mentioned this before, is Pico, P-I-C-O, his book on the dignity of man. Yeah.
The Oration.
Yeah, the Oration on the Dignity of Man. Written in 1427. A lot of people see that as unlocking a lot of the creativity in the Renaissance. And his point is that the first object of shaping is ourselves.
Yeah.
So rather than viewing us as victims or just part of a machine with cause and effect, we're actually agents. We're actually shaping individually and collectively. And so what we're looking at now with humanity having dominion over the cosmos is a system. It's no longer an individual. It's a system. And we all live in systems. I mean, the family's a system, organization's a system, our relationship with gardens, it's a system, and you can't have one without the other.
Yeah. And I'm just trying to remember, I think Pico actually says, he's got words to the effect, I think he says that the greatest gift God gives man, and you sort of think, oh yeah, it's going to end Jesus. And he says that we're given dominion over ourselves to craft ourselves into something that can be angelic or brutish.
Correct.
And that I don't know.
But his story is take a baby or two babies.
Yeah.
And he imagines two babies who are 6 weeks old. And then imagine an 80-year life.
Yeah.
And one of them becomes a tyrant and one of them becomes a saint.
Yeah.
Or, a great contributor to society. What he then says is the difference. Successive decisions of design made by that person as they designed their lives. And if we then look at some of the despots in the world today who are wreaking havoc, it all begins with a child that went this way versus a child that went that way. And so this idea of a role in the cosmos is incredibly important. Now, Tom Wright, in his book, The Day the Revolution Began, had he had a powerful way of describing this, because he was talking about very similar things, which is, so humanity as like a bridge or two-way mirror mediating between, on the one hand, the creation, and on the other hand, God. And it's a two-way mirror, like an angled mirror. So we're taking the creation up to God and taking God down into the creation, and that's this dominion role.
And there was something else in the Oration where he I don't know, I'm obviously going to paraphrase, but we're supposed to turn ourselves into banquet guests who are going to be good conversationalists with Jesus for into eternity. He doesn't quite say it like that, but it's an interesting idea that we're actually trying to he actually talks in terms of we are gifts from God to Jesus, and we're supposed to partake in that, turning ourselves into something that is worth giving to Jesus. It's a big idea. He got poisoned about 3 years later. I think he was 33 when they killed him. Yeah. That's clumsy, isn't it?
It's not a good idea to write a great book there.
No, it's not.
It's probably a good thing I haven't written a great book.
Wouldn't want to do that now.
Anyway, now we begin to move from that. And by the way, this idea of the cosmos, which I really got to credit a lot of the guys from region like Rick and Ian, and John Walton. Yeah. This idea of the cosmos, this political idea, the more you read the Old Testament, the more sense it makes. It's about kingdoms and epic battles. It's not about individual sin. I mean, we're going to do a breakfast with Jesus. I'm moving on to Ezekiel, and there's a famous chapter in Ezekiel. I don't know if it's famous, but it ought to be, where it's almost like for the first time Ezekiel says, and by the way, individuals are accountable. I forget the chapter, but it's like no one had said that.
New idea.
That was a new idea. Prior to that, it was political. Sin was political. It was not individual. So our modern idea that God's individually toting up the sins of the billions of people one by one, what a task, is simply not Old Testament.
And even going back to the dot thing, right? It's amazing how much people were doing theology in their own image. In that you had John Owen, who in Scotland, who was involved in crafting the Scottish Constitution. Queen Elizabeth I has the prayer book made, but the chief purpose of the prayer book was, the greatest act of propaganda in history, where overnight you've got a whole of the Catholic Church clergy, and you bring out this book and say, okay, you're going to follow this book, or you're going to get fined, if not jailed. And so you're in a political climate where sovereigns saw themselves as sovereign in that sense, and theology starts to imitate it. I asked Ian Program when we had lunch with him. I said, is there any chance that when the word sovereignty is used or sovereign is used in the Old Testament, that they mean anything that we think of in Reformed theology? And he said, not a chance. The idea of a sovereign was everyone was accountable to them, but they didn't control everything. But when you started, my hypothesis is when you're in a period of time where you've got tension between monarchs and princes, and you start legislating and writing constitutions and trying to really create law around everything, it doesn't surprise you that you end up maybe thinking that's how God relates to us, and maybe law is the way he relates to us.
Well, that's a two-way mirror thing, isn't it? I mean, depending what my view of God is, I'll mediate that into the world, and
vice versa,
and then vice versa. And so, and look, none of us, all of us influence power. We're parents, we're teachers, we're friends. I mean, the exercise of whatever you want to call it, influence over other people is absolutely central. And so the idea of, once we say that God's sphere of interest is the cosmos, our role in the cosmos and our political governorship is the main game. That's the game. Then the next stretch point, which is a very vital one, is that it appears that the cosmos is a contested political arena with enemies of God at work. That seems to be almost the major paradigm of the Old Testament now. And I know David Bentley Hart, but others would argue, and of the New Testament. We're talking principalities and powers.
Absolutely.
Now, this, and Tom Wright does emphasize this a lot. So God has enemies. He has enemies. So if we just humanize this a little bit.
So that again, that to some ears, that's an intolerable thought, in that God is so much God that, his enemies are nothing. He could deal with them whenever he wanted to, which I think is true, but it's obvious that Scripture is talking about these enemies, and the only way these enemies can have any influence is because God has given them a degree of dominion.
Yes, and I mean, how one interprets the fact that God allows enemies is a big topic, which you've taken us into. But nonetheless, there's no question the narrative of Scripture.
Absolutely,
the narrative of Scripture accepts that evil is personal.
Yeah,
and that so the great examples will be the Book of Daniel, where in the Book of Daniel there are there's first of all the statues with the four layers that the rock comes and smashes, and then there's the beasts. There's an epic contest, epic, which we know is picked up all throughout the New Testament, and it's not to do with individual sin at all. It's to do with, in Bulgakov's memorable phrase, the question that slithers like a serpent across the face of the earth is who will govern the cosmos. Now, that's what Daniel's about.
Yeah.
It's not about, individual sin. Did you tell a lie? Did you have sex before marriage? Did you do this, do that? Are you gay? Whatever you want to think, whatever you think sin is.
Yeah.
One by one, moral codes. It's about a huge arm wrestle between vast powers. Now, I like the way Tom handles. It's actually the way I've thought about it myself, which is I've studied history quite a lot. English was my main thing, but history was my second thing. And as I look today at Putin and the devastation there, or if I look at North Korea, I ask myself the question, is it enough to explain this merely by 6 human beings making some decisions? And I've never thought that's a good enough answer. It just feels to me like there's a vast force behind it, with it, cooperating with it. It just feels that way.
Yeah.
And it's interesting about if we look at the human mind, not the religious mind, the human artistic mind, what are the great movies? It's Star Wars, it's epic conflict. We're in the middle of a conflict between light and dark.
I think if you'd worked in corporate life,
I guess if you work in corporate life, you know all about dark forces.
That's right. You realise that
Executions.
You realise that you've got to conspire to get good things to happen, and bad things happen naturally, right? You don't need a conspiracy for bad things to happen in a company. That's just what naturally happens, and you're spending all your life trying to get people to conspire to do good. And the reason I think that is important is when you look at bad things that are happening, sometimes, well, we've never seen people work well to do good that well. And how can you get so many people to work to do bad so well, right? Just organising people is difficult.
Well, one of the great,
I think that's powers and principalities whispering in people's ears.
Yeah, it's good to get modern language for this, which because I think it helps people understand that some supernatural spooky idea of Satan and that needs to be modernized to some extent. A word that modernizes it to me is the word system. One of the most powerful corporate change experience I went through was in my long, perhaps decade, 15 years working with what was then CRA and is now Rio Tinto, the second biggest mining organisation in the world. And they, back in the 1990s, had a tremendous change program, the most effective change program of any corporation I've seen. And I was part of it. I influenced them, they influenced me. But part of their theory was a theory of systems. And they had a phrase that's never left my mind, which is systems drive behaviours. You can take a good person and you put them in a bad system and they'll do bad things. And equally, other way around, put a bad person in a good system and they'll do good things. Now, I don't want to go into that theory now, but it's something I've definitely seen in my life. And some of the great novels are written about that, where people just get swept along the tide of this system they're in, that they're not strong enough to, some of the great dramas are written on that drama. So the system is something bigger than all of us. A system is something bigger than any single person in it. But it seems to be like, I think Paul's picture in Ephesians 2 is the best one. It's like a tide, you were dead in trespasses and sins in which you walked according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit, this idea of a tide current. So that's the idea that this cosmos and this dominion has got a dark side, being it's now a contested space. Now we go to the fall, which is the nature of the dominion and the nature of why God doesn't intervene directly. And this is another big topic that and you've alluded to. Hang on, let me finish this. Otherwise I'll forget it. If God's going to get what he wants, he has to delegate, putting it in blunt terms. He cannot intervene directly. And we all know this in our lives. If I'm a parent, or if I'm a coach and I'm getting you to do something, I don't want to do it, I want you to do it. And I watch you and you fail and I jump in and I stop you failing, we don't get anywhere. I've actually got to let you go. Otherwise, I don't get what I want, because I can jump in, but if I jump in, I've got to jump in all the time. And I think all of us who have worked, certainly if you've run an organisation, which I've had, this, you confront this, it's actually quite a deep existential thing. I've actually got to step back, and so delegation is the only way I get amplification.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Otherwise, it'll just be up to me all the time. So we know in our human lives what it's like to actually have to create, and Donovan talks about this as authority rather than power.
Yeah.
If I've got power, I intervene directly. If I've got authority, I create a zone in which other people can play. So the creation is better thought of as an authority zone in which we play. Now, God will not, if he intervenes, it's the end of the project. The creation's finished. There's no longer a created order. It's all over, Red Rover. So he's got to let it go. But what we did, so we are vice regents in the Dominion. We're vice regents, and we then go to what happened in Genesis 3. So with that picture, what happened in Genesis 3? And in Genesis 3, we as vice regents invited the takeover of the organisation by dark forces. And, you know, I've
Goldman Sachs
or something. Yeah. I tried to, I can't quite get an analogy, but here goes. The best I can do is, if there is a owner who owns an organisation and they're benevolent, but they've totally delegated the running of that organisation to a CEO, and that CEO has access to some preferential shares, whatever, and for various reasons, he lets a hostile foreign party with whom he gets into cahoots and has conversations, and they come in and take over the voting rights, and they take the company away and they start running the company. The owner can still own it, but they've lost the voting rights. I've actually seen palpable examples of that happening, where you know, the company I created is taken away from me. So something like that is more. So therefore, rather than seeing what happened in Genesis 3 as the fall, I would prefer to call it the takeover. It's a takeover where we, with our delegated powers of dominion and decision-making, had the wrong conversation and invited these hostile forces into the cosmos. And Tom talks about that extensively, and I think very well, in this book. So now what we've done is we've invited into the cosmic order dark forces who are very powerful and make a terrible alliance with our creativity and our imago Dei to screw up God's project. So we've now got lost dominion. And that is now, I guess, my best attempt so far to start from Genesis 1 with what's the problem. So it's lost dominion rather than individual sin and transgression of moral codes. They may have been a subset of that picture.
Symptoms.
Yes. So the effects of that are now the earth is, there's bad rule on the earth, and we're now in desperate straits. And, you know, I think theologically the impact of sin and entropy on the world. So the only other thing I'd add to that top-down theological picture of lost dominion is it does really pave the way for the cross, because as a human being, we'll get to that in the end, as a human being's got to change the situation and have another conversation, which we can talk about in the end. So that's the top-down picture. Is that all right?
Yeah, I like that. The only change I would make is it's much more personal than just appointing the CEO, because it's think Roman times where you appoint somebody you want somebody to be your heir, right? So it's an intensely personal thing, because it's not just you've gone out to the market and found a CEO. This is the person that you want to share this business with and be able to leave it to them.
And they betrayed.
And you expect them to treat you as chairman and, you know, to give them wise and godly tutelage as they learn how to run the business that you've created. And so I would say there's much more relational currency that I'd introduce. And then somehow Goldman Sachs came in and gets control, convinces them your dad, or the guy who's acting as your dad, he doesn't know what he's talking about. We can turn this into a ripper of a business for a modest fee of about $500 million.
Well, it is vaguely reminiscent of what happened at Fairfax, but you better not go there. As it was the family, and it was the whatever his name was, Rothwell, wasn't it, from Western Australia, who came in and
gee, that's a while ago.
Yeah, it was shocking. It killed. I mean, they're visceral examples of strangling a company by. Anyway, that's where we're up to. You had some what you called exegetical, where there are various words that are in play in penal substitution and in the fall that you can look at for us.
So I think we've talked about different approaches to the whole atonement issue. So and there is certainly intuitively, I can see how the theological approach is probably the starting point for most people in challenging it. But I think theology sometimes becomes a bit like warfare, in that the theological approach is like your artillery, but sooner or later you've got to send somebody in and go door to door in street fighting and open every house.
You're going to do street fighting.
Yeah, well, that's right. Well, no, I just think that's what we've got to do sooner or later. I like the top down. I don't like the detail, but
no, I think we need them both.
That's how you win the masses over, because at some point in time you've got to go through a series of, all right, we talked about this. Measure at something.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Perhaps. What's for those listening? That was Siri. We don't know how to shut her up.
So, is there 3 atonement metaphors or 10 metaphors? There's a number of them. You've actually got to go through with the metaphors and see whether your theory that you've come up with fits better than somebody else's theory. And that's why penal substitutionary atonement has done well, partly because it deals with atonement metaphors, but partly because of the political background we're in around Dort, we've elevated some of those metaphors to be much higher and relegated the others. So there's work to do there. But even I think we've got to re-look at the word righteousness. And I've raised before, Edwin Judge said this, Leon Morris has said this, lots of people have said we're probably not using the word righteousness in the same way that the Greeks were when the Bible writers decided to use it. And that, again, is very frightening, because this is like having your finger on the Chernobyl button, and no one wants to really shake the righteousness box and see what might be in there, because righteousness has the same Greek root word as justification, and we're justified by
Decao.
So we're justified by.
So the word justification and righteousness is very similar, almost the same word.
Same word. But and so when your big debate that's defined your group is justification by faith,
or made righteous by faith,
and I think Glenn Davies did his PhD on the use of righteousness, I think, in the first.
So don't keep me in suspense. What are you going to do with the word, Andrew?
Well, all right. So you'll remember that Anselm says the engine that drives the atonement is God's honour, and so he said, God is like a feudal landlord, and if his honour's taken, then somebody's got to be punished, just not randomly. So it's just a strange way of doing theology. the reformers said, no, it's not God's honor, but they put in this concept of righteousness, which was a very, very legal idea. And that's what was going on. You had, they're writing constitutions and things like that. So they think, yes, righteousness is legal.
So righteousness becomes some kind of adherence to a penal code, to a code of law.
Yeah. And again,
a big examination paper, I pass or fail at.
Yeah, it's a law. It's a law. And God is subservient to this law, which never made sense to me. But
nonetheless, it's the idea of rules and codes, that's intrinsic. It's almost like it's a big legislative code.
Yeah, and people say because it reflects God's character, and you think, man, you've moved God from being love to God being law. If the primary thing about God is righteousness and law, as opposed to, well, what if there's a way of looking at righteousness that is love? Because we know the word is used before Christians turn up, right? So there's something about righteousness, and I think I pointed out last time, Edwin Judge said it's got to do with the cosmos being in the right place. Harmony, right? So the cosmos is like that beautiful...
Well, cosmos means elegance and beauty.
Yeah, and they had a belief that the cosmos worked in a way that was a beautiful... I wouldn't say mechanism, but they thought it was beautiful in how it worked. And if you did something... If you were too good or too bad, you could throw the cosmos out of alignment.
So this aligns with John Walton's concept of order being, and you can almost now begin to say, oh, well, a better meaning for righteousness will be beauty.
Once you say that, and you realize the New Testament will talk about God's righteousness, which you think, if there's only one righteousness, you don't have to say that. You say God's righteousness when you're trying to say there's something different about God's righteousness. And I think the righteousness that humans tend to want is, we'll talk about, we want justice, but what we want somebody to be punished. Yeah. It's punitive. It's
revenge.
Yeah. And so that feels like theology in our own image. And you look at the parables about lost son and so forth, and you realize God is not like us. He's not like the nations. He is other than the nations. He's radically different. He's holy. And what if he's talking in terms of his justice doesn't require somebody being killed? That's an interesting one, because we're not saying that Jesus wasn't killed, but what if his justice doesn't require that? What is it that would require that?
So that's a really powerful excursion into that word. And I think the part that I hadn't heard you say before tonight, but I think is helps us break the paradigm, because I think the word righteous for all of us has strong legalistic connotations. The idea of righteousness is beauty and harmony, and that the cosmos, going back now to the idea of the cosmos being God's sphere of operations and interest, is to be ordered and beautiful. And I think to your point, you've mentioned Edwin a few times, and I'm pretty sure, unfortunately, I'm now relying only on memory and a conversation I had with Edwin where, this was not recorded, it was a private conversation, where he told me he'd seen that word, or a cognate of that word across a marketplace.
Yeah.
Describe the marketplace, a Greek pagan marketplace. Being righteous, meaning that in this marketplace there's order. You can trust the prices, you can trust the supply and the quality, and that if the marketplace was not righteousness, we couldn't participate in it. And it was almost like it was assuming there was order in that we can now all trust in to play our game.
Yeah, and not necessarily because there's some punitive forces out there who are going to drive you to it.
It was an invitation to freedom and initiative, and, to your word, trust of relationships within that. So I thought that was a really thought-provoking.
And I would still want to say, I think God's righteousness is going to probably be richer than the way the Greeks used it.
Yeah.
But I think this is the point Leon Morris points out. It's straight, like in 1955. It's almost impossible that the way we're using righteousness since the Reformation is what was intended by the writers of the text. Now that is like, theologically, that's like having your finger on the Chernobyl button.
It doesn't bother me, the Chernobyl button. I like pushing.
Well, it's just an issue that
you've got to blow things up, Andrew.
Well, maybe not.
You have to blow things up in order to remake them.
But I think you can do that if our intuition tells us that if we do that, it'll come back better than it is.
Yeah.
Where a lot of people's intuition is, if I lose that, I've got nothing. You know, exactly. and so it's really quite frightening for most people to theologically head towards the Chernobyl button.
But I'm just, while we're on the Chernobyl button, I find it so intriguing. I mean, I used to tell my children, look, just to console yourself in life, understand this, that the most essential quality of human beings is hypocrisy. You and others. Once you get that, you'll live a happier life.
Yeah.
And you get today Reformed people who will not want to press the Chernobyl. Well, guess what Luther did?
Yeah.
You want to talk about Chernobyl buttons?
Absolutely.
You're pinning your hopes on a guy who blew up everything. He blew up everything, just far more than you know if you read the stories. Yeah. And I was like, well, so pressing the Chernobyl button's important sometimes.
No, it's absolutely. Again, there was a period of time, about 200 years ago, where women in labour were 20 times as likely to die if a doctor delivered the baby compared with a midwife. 20 times. And they believed in miasma, that this foul-smelling air is the way sickness moved around. Now, while everyone had that view, they didn't ask the right questions about why is it that midwives have a 20 times, not 20% rate, 20 times success rate or less death rate. And it wasn't until somebody actually said, and they were much maligned, right? And on that, I keep a list of people who've won Nobel Prizes and great things who've been maligned and how many years it took before they got accepted. But the guy who started saying, hey, if we just wash our hands between touching cadavers and other patients, we'll probably kill less women. It's something that we take really obvious now. These doctors, top of the field, doctors are dangerous. They had no idea because they weren't able to challenge the word that came down from above.
So it's okay to press the Chernobyl.
You got to do it.
Now that's one word. I want you to talk about propitiation, which is hilasterion in Greek.
Yeah. All right. So I remember people talking about the NRSV when it was translated. So that must have been the 50s, I assume. And C.H. Dodd had been very influential. And had tried, I don't think he succeeded. There was a word that was translated propitiation, which is the idea of turning away anger, which we talked about
appeasing the gods.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a word used by pagans to appease the gods. Yeah,
and
I think it's used in John's epistles.
And
we should have done more preparation.
We should have done that one. But the interesting bit was what Edwin said. And often it got translated as expiation, which meant that wrath was dealt with in some way, but it wasn't actually about the wrath. So, and that's what propitiation. And now if you look at the NRSV, which is 30 years old, I think they just said sacrifice of atonement. They just tried to stay away from it. The problem with hilasterion, the word that we're playing with, I think it turns up twice in the Bible, and I don't think they actually had any occurrences in the Greek world. So
it's a very hard word to translate.
It's a hard word to translate. And so
just so that people know, because John Walton explained this to me, there's no dictionary when you're doing translation. No. It's more like a crossword puzzle. Yeah, and the way they work out the meaning of a word is they just find all the other meanings. So if a word is used 20 other times, we get a pretty good idea of what it could mean because we sort of average it out across those 20. If a word's used once or twice, it's really tricky because there's nothing to compare it to, which is what you're saying.
Yeah, so what you try to do is work out what the context is
around it.
But I'll use another illustration, but you'll end up inserting your theology in that way. Now, the interesting thing is I have not tracked this down. Edwin sort of whispered to me again, wish I'd recorded everything he said, that a fragment had been identified that had this word in it. and it was Nero or Tiberius. Somebody an emperor had been given a gift, a thank you gift for visiting their city. And all of a sudden that changes your whole view of the word. Because
So the word was a thank you gift.
Well, yeah, well, the
Hilasterian.
The Hilasterian was just a thank you gift.
So propitiation
there was no anger.
thank you gift.
Yeah, he'd come and visited, he'd gone, gave them, and so it just, now I'm not saying that you want to say there's no sacrifice or atonement or no anger in scripture. It's just there are a few words there which we backfill with our theology, which we've got to we've got to be a little bit careful and not do that. Now one of the illustrations I don't think I've used is have we talked about Alistair McIntyre, who wrote the After Virtue? We haven't. All right. He's got this little passage that is sort of a throwaway line about how language works. And he tells the story. The reason I'm telling you this is this is how we often do theology, right? The mind is a rumour factory. We're given some utterances in scripture. And when there are missing bits, our rumour factory mind starts filling in the bits. And that's why we've got to do theology in community, to say, hey, that's rubbish, that doesn't work. Anyway, the illustration that he uses is, he said he was studying in New York, I think. Studying in a library in Washington. It was midwinter, it was dark, it was raining. And at the end of the day, he goes to a bus shelter, dark, raining, and somebody comes out and says, Histronicus, Histronicus, Histronicus is the Latin name for the wild duck, right? So there's your utterance. And he said, immediately your mind's got to do something with that, because it doesn't make sense without a context. And so your mind makes up the context. He said, okay, the first thing is you think this guy's been to a psychiatrist or something. He's obviously mad. The next thing that popped up in his mind, he said, no, this is Washington. That could be the recognition code for a spy. And then the smarter part of his brain goes, maybe it's dark. And somebody's asked him that question earlier in the day in a library, because he's come out of the same library. And maybe that it's just a mistake. And the important thing about that, going back to belief shapes behaviour, that the same utterance can get three different responses. If you're convinced that he's mad, you'll probably withdraw. If you think he's a spy, you might turn into a bit of a hero and try to do a citizen's arrest, and you go forward. But when you realise, no, it's probably just an accident, you stand down. Now, we've got to concede, I think, that we've got text, and there are gaps that we have, that we fill up with rumours. And until we're honest about some of our theology is more in the category of rumour than text, we won't ask those necessary questions.
Yeah, so if you've got a penal model,
Yeah.
which is kind of like saying the guy's mad, the guy's mad, the guy's mad, you're going to start interpreting everything and fitting it into that model.
Yep.
And you could take a word like propitiation, which could mean something, as you've said, more like, say, thank you offering. Well, I had an example that's slightly more sinister than that, which is the dear old NIV.
The old NIV, yeah.
No, the NIV.
Oh, okay, still current one.
Still current one. This is just an example, I think, of another issue, which is not just taking a word and translating it a certain way, but inserting a word in there that's not there.
Yep.
So this came about simply because we were doing a Bible study in Romans 8 in our church. They translate Romans 8 like this: for what the law was powerless to do, in that it was weakened by the sinful nature. That's a bad phrase. We know that.
That's the old one.
That's the old one. God did by sending his own son in the likeness of sinful man to be a sin offering. So that's their translation, in which case you would say to yourself, oh, that's interesting. There it is, a sin offering. So Christ is a sin offering, and immediately we're back in the Levitical system and so on. And you would say, well, if I went and looked at the Greek, I would find a noun for sin offering. If you looked at what David Bentley Hart translates it as, it is the thing that is impossible for the law, in which it was weak on account of the flesh. That's pretty much the same. God having sent, except flesh for sinful nature, God having sent his own son in a semblance of the flesh of sin, also as regards sin, condemns sin in the flesh. So there's no word there, sin offering.
No.
You go to the ESV, very similar to David. For God has done what the law weakened by the flesh could not do, by sending his own son in the likeness of sinful flesh, and thus he condemns sin in the flesh. So I've looked at the Greek text. There is no sin offering there. So they've put a paraphrase in and stuck in this word sin offering, which now probably millions of people are reading, assuming there's a sin offering, and there is no such word.
And even the sinful nature, I think it's interesting. I don't know if I'm about to say this. It's a fascinating read going through the preface of the 2011 NIV.
Yeah, I know they.
Yeah, because
they're sorry.
Because they say they're sorry for a whole lot of things, like the phrase "sinful nature" is
terrible.
I had
it. Yeah, exactly.
And so they're actually quite repentant of the. What is it, 1984 version or something? Oh, not the whole thing, but
well, I was
words
the
like
same Bible study I was at the other night. I actually took them. This sweet lady, she's a doctor, she's a lovely, wonderful lover of God, and she's beautifully reading it. And I just said, look, I won't mention her name. It's not sinful nature; it's flesh. I said,
Jesus had flesh.
I said it's the NIV. Oh, she said, are you telling me the NIV is wrong? Yes, I'm telling you the NIV is wrong. Should I burn it? It probably should. At the very least, get another translation so you can compare it. It's a shocker. And I won't tell you what David Bentley Hart told me about it, because it's not, he probably wouldn't mind, but I'm not going to say it. Anyway, that's a different thing. That's what you're talking about. We know the word propitiation, hilasterion, is there, and how I interpret it is one thing. The other thing, though, is when words are interpolated as a paraphrase to pad out a meaning, and that's sinister.
Yeah,
and
because part of the translator's fear is when there's ambiguity and vagueness in the text, is people will make up rumours. So instead of them making up a rumour, I'll make up a rumour. Yeah.
Well, the worst case I know of, which is just, it is so sad, it's beyond belief, is 1 Thessalonians. I think it's 1 Thessalonians. It's where it talks about destruction. And some people were translating it into a Papuan dialect. And in the Papuan dialect, the word destruction, once they translated it into the Papuan dialect, sounded something like annihilation. And this person, and they wrote this out on their missionary newsletter, thought, oh dear me, they'll think that there's just going to be annihilation, we better get it right. And they inserted for destruction a full sentence on eternal conscious torment. A full sentence in eternal conscious torment. That's not the end of the story. The two young, they were doing cross-translation, so they had a couple of young Papuan ladies who read it and were shocked. They were shocked by eternal conscious torment, and they said, does this mean that our parents and relatives before the missionaries are in eternal torment? And the missionary said, yes, we assured them they were in hell. And they were sobered and saddened and shocked. Praise God. Not exaggerated. So that's dark.
Yeah, it is dark.
That's dark. Anyway, that's moving away from the darkness to one or two other words, and then we'll finish off.
Yeah.
You said some very good things to me on adoption.
Yeah.
As better thought of as disinherited. Just could you repeat that?
Yeah. So, all right. When we start doing the exegetical things, we'll have to go and go through every word of righteousness and see whether the theory works, a different theory. And even at some level, looking at the metaphors and trying to work out what are the metaphors really about. And I picked this up in J.I. Packer's Knowing God as a teenager. He, about 2/3 of the way through, he has this rant about why is nobody doing any PhDs on adoption, because he argues, it's a great little read, about how important adoption is and how adoption is that word that we usually translate. We'll talk about reconciliation, and reconciliation sort of implies there's a bit of a relationship that goes wrong and you fix it up, which is slightly different to you were disinherited and you're being adopted. And this goes back to the whole question of what was Christ's death really paying for? Was it paying for my sins, or was it paying for Adam's sin? Right? Were we corporately caught up in that, or is it a very individualistic thing? So once you realise that one of those metaphors is about adoption, and you've got a number of metaphors, why are we concentrating so much on the exchange, a penal one which we might be overstating? Well, it's actually hard. If you line up the metaphors, it's hard to find a metaphor that's about penalty.
Yes, it's very hard.
It's not there.
Okay, so
that's not one of the atonement metaphors.
Look, I think time's gone on. We should wrap up. I just think, in summary, just because we've taken a wander through a lot of territory, the big words dominion.
Yep.
Framing the issue as lost dominion. How that now starts to imply cosmic significance, and then re-looking at some of the traditional penal substitutionary atonement words through that lens.
Yep.
And even that one, adoption, inheritance, disinheritance, makes a lot more sense if I've lost office. And the last point you made about Jesus being a substitute for Adam, we'll come to that one next week, because I think that's really what that begins to do. I mean, what we've been doing is painting a new picture of the quote unquote fall as takeover, lost dominion, which now begins to, I think, having framed it that way, we're now much better situated to move now to Calvary, now to what happened with the restitution in Christ. The very meaning of redemption can now get amplified as regaining dominion on behalf of humanity, or something like that.
Absolutely.
Cool. All right. Well,
we should talk about what the next one's going to be.
The next one will be, you're going to give us speaking of things that need to be rethought.
Genesis 22.
Genesis 22.
And the almost sacrifice of Isaac.
Yeah, which is often taken as almost the Old Testament's proof text for penal substitution.
Yeah, and
don't say what you're going to talk about.
Yeah,
Keep people in suspense.
But we've got a paper that we'll try to circulate.
Correct.
So you read the paper, and then I'll read it again next time. We'll probably do this around the 2nd of June, and then we'll have a question time around it. So it'll be pretty straightforward, but it's quite a dense little paper, so it'd be good to read it before.
We'll send that out with the invitation. Okay, great. Thank you very much.